Assalamu alaikum. Here I am with you again on Vietnam War, and in this lecture I would like to expand more so how this war affected American society and American youth especially, and also the scene of the civil rights and the black power also come under this. So it's going to be a little general about lecture about the effects of this Vietnam War in American society and how the youth took it. Anywhere in making a public opinion, media plays a very strong role. While Johnson was lecturing the public about upholding national honor and standing by commitments, but anti-war criticism continued to mount. In most earlier wars, Congress had imposed strict control on what journalists could report to the public. Because the Vietnam War was undeclared, Johnson had to resort to informal, though at first effective, ways of managing information. With television coverage making Vietnam a living room war, Johnson kept 3 television sets playing in his office in order to monitor the major networks. Sometimes he would phone the news anchor after their broadcast and castigate them for their stories. The Johnson treatment, some called it. Doesn't sound something familiar these days? Frank Stanton reportedly received, network's president of CBS, received this call. Frank, are you trying to, and then he used the 4-letter word. This is your president, and yesterday your boys shat on the American flag. And increasingly sensitive to criticism, Johnson equated any question or doubt about his policy in Vietnam with a lack of patriotism. Anti-war activists were equally disturbed by what they regarded as the media's uncritical reporting on the war. In time, however, the effect of the news coverage became less ambiguous. The unrelenting images of destruction on the nightly news and in Life magazine's photos, whatever their intent, turned people against the war. In addition, a few journalists forthrightly expressed their opposition. Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times sent reports from Vietnam that dramatized the destructiveness of US bombing mission. Gloria Emerson's grim and widely read reports portrayed the war as a class-based effort in which the United States used poor and disproportionately non-white fighting forces, while rich men with draft-exempt sons ranked in war profits. As the war dragged on, Americans became polarized into hawks and doves. Johnson insisted that he was merely following the containment policy favored by Eisenhower and Kennedy. Secretary of State Dean Russ spoke of dangers of appeasement, but influential senators, including William Fulbright of Arkansas, chair of the powerful Foreign Relations Committee, and Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, warned misplaced priorities and an arrogance of power. Meanwhile, anti-war protesters began to challenge the structure of American society at home. Millions came to oppose the war in Southeast Asia, and support eroded for the Great Society at home. By 1968, the recent years of slowly building tensions appeared to reach a critical point. And during the early 1960s, small groups of people, many of them college students, came to reject the welfare state policies of the post-war years. In 1962, 2 years after conservative activists had formed Young Americans for Freedom, insurgents on the left established an organization called Students for a Democratic Society. This Students for a Democratic Society became an important part of a new left, a political insurgency that tried to distance itself from both the welfare state policies of the Great Society and the old communist-inspired left. By charging that the dominant culture valued bureaucratic expertise over citizen engagement and conspicuous consumption over meaningful work, the New Left sought to create an alternative vision. It called for participatory democracy, grassroots politics responsive to the wishes of local communities rather than the preferences of national elites. Isn't it a familiar scene in democracies? We felt that we were different, that we were going to do things differently. Recall one early SDS member. It felt like the dawn of a new age. And during 1960s, many young white college students found inspiration from the anti-discrimination movement in the Deep South. Risking racist violence, they went to the South where they forged bonds of community with African American activists. Some remained in the South or migrated to political projects in northern neighborhoods. Others returned to their college campuses and joined New Left protests against both the war in Southeast Asia and social conditions at home. Many campuses became embroiled in bitter strife at teach-ins. Supporters and opponents of the war presented their positions and debated the morality of the war, presented their positions and debated the morality of the involvement of universities in national security policies. Teach-ins soon gave way to less structured demonstrations. And as the debate broadened, conservatives, including Ronald Reagan, who was elected governor of California in 1966, made opposition to campus protest a prominent part of their new agenda. So this Vietnam War was creating a counterculture at home. Accompanying the spread of this new left politics was the rise of much publicized counterculture. Only a relatively small percentage of young people fully embraced countercultural values, but the mass media immediately portrayed devotees of cultural insurgency, caricatured as hippies, as representatives of a broad-based youth revolt. Rejecting traditional attitudes on such matters as clothing, hairstyling, a spokespeople for the counterculture espoused an open experimental approach to daily life. Members of the counterculture often championed causes such as environmentalism and sparked interest in natural foods. Bob Dylan, who had been a central figure in the revival of acoustical folk music in the early 1960s, suddenly went electric in 1965, and reworking musical idioms used by African Americans, blue artists such as Muddy Waters. Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone 1965 exploded onto both the top 40 charts of AM radio and the freewheeling playlist of the new alternative FM station. Music in Western societies always plays as a great mark of change. And it does so in our societies too, though it takes a little more time. A much publicized march on the Pentagon in 1967 crystallized growing controversy over the counterculture. Moving beyond burning draft cards as a symbol of anti-war protests, some of the marchers chanted mystical incantations and claimed they hoped to levitate the Pentagon. Extensive media coverage of counterculture happenings such as this and their relationship to political and social change sparked a lively and ongoing debate. The New Left claimed that media attention on the counterculture actually undercut anti-war politics. The media's insatiable need for spectacle demonstrations and more exciting celebrities from the youth culture, they charged trivialized issues that insurgents were trying to articulate in new, more powerful ways. Moreover, innovative ways of using mass-mediated imagery seemed to offer insurgents their best hope for building viable alternative movements. And let's try to connect this counterculture and the change in attitudes to civil rights and to black power. Sharp debate over the role of the media and its relationship to political and cultural insurgency also accompanied the new directions in the campaign against racial discrimination that emerged in mid-1960s. Excuse me. At the same time, the media became the forum for debate over what was increasingly being called a racial crisis. Conservatives argued the subversive agitators were provoking conflict and violence. Excuse me. And that only a firm commitment to law and order would ease racial tensions. Meanwhile, a new black power movement was emerging, heralded by a charismatic minister, Malcolm X. A member of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X differed with leaders of the civil rights movement. He considered King's gradualist, non-violent approach to political change as irrelevant to the social and economic problem of most African Americans, and proclaimed that integration was unworkable, although he never called for violent confrontation. Within this context, Civil Rights Act of 1968 passed Congress. One provision of this omnibus law finally extended the constitutional guarantees of the Bill of Rights to American Indians. Another, popularly known as the Fair Housing Act, addressed racial discrimination in housing. In response to complaints that its provisions infringe on the rights of landlords and real estate agents, however, the Act included exemption that made it cumbersome to enforce. Civil libertarians countered that it unconstitutionally invoked the power of the federal government against activists, especially those preaching black power. By 1968, America was facing violence at home. One person who rejoiced at Johnson's withdrawal was Martin Luther King Jr. He hoped that the Democratic Party would now turn to an anti-war liberal, preferably Senator Robert Kennedy of New York, who might embrace King's new program for economic transformation. But on April 4, 1968, during a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of a strike by African American sanitation workers, King was assassinated. Allegedly, a lone gunman named James Earl Ray was the assassin. Ray quickly pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 99 years. He subsequently recanted and crusaded unsuccessfully for a new trial. When he died in 1998, Ray still insisted that he had been nothing more than a pawn of a racist conspiracy. The violence in American society continued throughout 1968. Although Hubert Humphrey left the Chicago Confection with the Democratic presidential nomination, but controversy over Johnson's Vietnam policies and over the response to anti-war demonstrations left his party badly divided. And that is how Vietnam War really impacted the American politics and society.